In the early hours of December 7, 1941, as the sun rose over the Pacific Ocean, a force unlike any previously assembled in naval history approached the Hawaiian Islands under cover of darkness and radio silence. 6 aircraft carriers, escorted by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, had traveled more than 3,000 miles across the vast Pacific to deliver what would become the most consequential surprise attack in modern history. The Empire of Japan, a nation that had spent decades transforming itself from feudal isolation to industrial modernity, was about to embark on the most audacious and ultimately tragic chapter in its long history. The story of Japan's involvement in World War II cannot be understood merely as a sequence of military campaigns and political decisions. It is, fundamentally, the story of a nation caught between two worlds, between its ancient traditions and its modern ambitions, between its island geography and its continental aspirations, between its pursuit of security and its descent into catastrophic overreach. It is the story of a people who would experience the full spectrum of human emotion and endurance, from the intoxicating heights of early victory to the devastating depths of nuclear destruction and unconditional surrender. The roots of this catastrophe stretch back decades before the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. Japan's rise to great power status was rapid, with victorious wars over China 1894–95 and Russia 1904–5, as well as successful, if subsidiary, role on the side of the Allies in World War I 1914–1918. Again and again, Japan struck quickly to win wars over larger and theoretically more powerful opponents. These early victories instilled in Japanese military and political leaders a dangerous confidence in their ability to overcome superior force through superior will, superior preparation, and the element of surprise. The very success Japan enjoyed, however, placed the island empire squarely in the sights of the other great powers, and generated an increasingly tense strategic rivalry with the United States for domination of the Pacific. This rivalry would prove to be the long fuse of the Great Pacific War, 1941–45, the long-term background to Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. What began as competition for influence and resources would evolve into an existential struggle that would reshape the entire Pacific region and leave Japan itself transformed beyond recognition. The immediate causes of Japan's decision to go to war with the United States were rooted in the escalating conflict in China that had begun in 1937. War between Japan and the Republic of China had begun in 1937, with hostilities dating back to Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931. But this regional conflict became increasingly entangled with global politics as the world moved toward general war. In the 1930s, Imperial Japan wanted to secure its dominance in the Pacific. It forged an alliance with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy in 1937. This alliance would last through the end of World War II in 1945. As Japan became mired in the China conflict, the United States began to take increasingly hostile measures designed to force Japanese withdrawal from Chinese territory. The United States sought to curb Japanese aggression and force Japan to withdraw from Manchuria and China. In 1940, the United States restricted exports to Japan. In 1941, the United States imposed economic sanctions on Japan. These sanctions struck at the heart of Japan's strategic vulnerability, its complete dependence on foreign sources of raw materials, particularly oil. Japan was faced with severe shortages of oil and other natural resources. Driven by these shortages and the ambition to expand its empire, Japan decided to attack U.S. and British territories in the Pacific. The economic stranglehold imposed by the United States left Japan with what its leaders saw as only two choices: submit to American demands and abandon its empire, or strike out in a desperate attempt to secure the resources necessary for national survival and regional dominance. The decision to attack was not made lightly. Japanese political and military leaders understood the enormous risks involved in challenging the industrial might of the United States. However, they believed that a swift, decisive blow that crippled American naval power in the Pacific would create a window of opportunity during which Japan could establish an impregnable defensive perimeter across the Pacific. Behind this perimeter, Japan would be able to exploit the resources of Southeast Asia while negotiating from a position of strength for a favorable peace settlement. The architect of this audacious strategy was Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, commander of the Combined Fleet. Yamamoto Isoroku, the commander-in-chief of Japan's Combined Fleet, had planned the attack against the U.S. Pacific Fleet with great care. Yamamoto was a reluctant warrior who had lived in the United States and understood American industrial capacity better than most of his colleagues. He believed that Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States, but that a series of rapid victories might force the Americans to accept a negotiated settlement rather than pay the enormous cost of a Pacific war. The Japanese believed that once the U.S. Pacific Fleet was neutralized, all of Southeast Asia would be open for conquest. Once the U.S. fleet was out of action, the way for the unhindered Japanese conquest of all of Southeast Asia and the Indonesian archipelago would be open. The plan was breathtaking in its scope and ambition, calling for simultaneous attacks across thousands of miles of ocean against targets from Hawaii to Southeast Asia. The preparations for this massive operation required months of meticulous planning and training. The order for the assault was issued on November 5, 1941, and on November 16, the task force began its rendezvous in the Kuril Islands. Commanders were instructed that the fleet might be recalled, however, in case of a favorable outcome of the negotiations in Washington, D.C. Even as the attack force moved into position, Japanese diplomats in Washington continued negotiations with Secretary of State Cordell Hull, maintaining the pretense of seeking a peaceful solution to the crisis. The attack itself would unfold with devastating precision and effect. On December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy conducted a surprise air and sea assault on the U.S. Naval Station Pearl Harbor, located on the Hawaiian island of Oahu. At this time, the U.S. Pacific Fleet was docked at Pearl Harbor. The first Japanese dive bomber appeared over Pearl Harbor at 7:55 a.m. local time on December 7, 1941. The destruction that followed was swift and terrible. 8 of the 9 American battleships at the harbor were either sunk or damaged. More than 150 American aircraft were destroyed. On a single day, more than 2,300 American service people were killed, and nearly 1,200 Americans were wounded. In the early hours of 7th December, Hawaiian time, carrier-based Japanese aircraft launched a surprise, large-scale airstrike on the U.S. Pacific Fleet's anchorage at Pearl Harbor in Honolulu, which knocked 8 American battleships out of action, destroyed 188 American aircraft, and killed 2,403 Americans. The shock of the attack reverberated far beyond the immediate military damage. The fact that the bombing happened while the U.S. was not officially at war caused a wave of outrage across the country. American outrage at the surprise attack overcame isolationist sentiment, and the United States declared war on Japan the following day. President Franklin Roosevelt's speech to Congress captured the national mood when he declared December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. However, Pearl Harbor was only the beginning of a carefully coordinated offensive across the Pacific. Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, also attacked the Philippines, Wake Island, Guam, Malaya, Thailand, Shanghai, and Midway. Although the assault on Pearl Harbor became the most notorious event to occur on December 7, 1941, it was not the only target attacked that day. Japanese forces struck multiple U.S. territories in the Pacific, including the Philippines, Guam, Midway Island, and Wake Island. They also attacked the British territories of Malaya, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Within a week, Japan controlled all of these territories. The strategic conception behind these simultaneous attacks was brilliant in its comprehensiveness. By striking at multiple targets across thousands of miles of ocean, Japan prevented its enemies from concentrating their defenses at any single point. The attacks were carefully timed to take advantage of time zones and the element of surprise, ensuring that each target was caught off guard and unable to benefit from warnings that might have come from earlier attacks elsewhere. The immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor seemed to vindicate Japanese strategic thinking. The Japanese believed that the Americans, faced with such a sudden and massive blow to their naval power in the Pacific, would agree to a negotiated settlement. However, this calculation proved to be fundamentally flawed. American losses were less serious than initially thought. The 3 American aircraft carriers were at sea during the attack, and vital naval infrastructure, Honolulu's submarine base, and signals intelligence units were unscathed. More importantly, the attack had precisely the opposite psychological effect than Japanese leaders had anticipated. Rather than crushing American will to fight, Pearl Harbor unified a previously divided nation behind a war effort that would ultimately mobilize resources on a scale unprecedented in human history. American opinion immediately shifted to favoring war with Japan, a course that would conclude with Japan's unconditional surrender less than 4 years later. The period immediately following Pearl Harbor marked the high tide of Japanese expansion. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan won a series of military victories. In December 1941, Guam, Wake Island, and Hong Kong fell to the Japanese. This was followed in the first half of 1942 by the Philippines, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia, Malaya, and Singapore. The Japanese amassed a vast new empire with a defensive perimeter that ranged from western Alaska to the Solomon Islands. These early victories seemed to confirm the wisdom of Japanese strategy and the superiority of Japanese arms. Japanese forces demonstrated remarkable skill in amphibious warfare, coordinated air and naval operations, and jungle fighting. Their success was all the more remarkable, given that they were often outnumbered by their opponents and fighting at great distances from their home bases. The conquest of Southeast Asia provided Japan with access to the raw materials it desperately needed: oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Burma and Indochina. For the first time in its modern history, Japan appeared to have achieved the resource self-sufficiency that had long been the dream of its strategic planners. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, Japan's ideological justification for its conquests, seemed to be becoming a reality. However, even as Japanese forces celebrated these early victories, ominous signs were beginning to appear. Japan's fallback strategy, relying on a war of attrition against the United States, was beyond the Imperial Japanese Navy's capabilities. The industrial capacity that had enabled Japan to achieve its early successes was dwarfed by that of the United States, and time was not on Japan's side. American industrial might proved too great to overcome. While Japan was struggling to replace its losses and maintain its extended defensive perimeter, American shipyards and aircraft factories were beginning to produce vessels and planes at a rate that would soon overwhelm any force Japan could deploy. The United States was transforming its peacetime economy into what would become history's most powerful war machine. The first major check to Japanese expansion came sooner than anyone had anticipated. In June 1942, a decisive aircraft carrier battle near Midway Island marked the end of Japanese expansion. The Battle of Midway represented a crucial turning point in the Pacific War, demonstrating that Japanese forces were not invincible and that American naval power could successfully challenge Japanese supremacy in the Pacific. Admiral Yamamoto viewed the operation against Midway as the potentially decisive battle of the war, which could lead to the destruction of American strategic power in the Pacific, and subsequently allow for a negotiated peace settlement. Yamamoto hoped that the operation would lure the American surface fleet into a trap. The Japanese intended their attack on Midway to act as bait for the bulk of the U.S. Navy's strength in the Pacific, which Japanese planners anticipated would depart Pearl Harbor in order to defend the island. When the American vessels arrived, Yamamoto intended to concentrate his scattered naval forces to defeat them. The plan was tactically sound and strategically necessary, but it failed catastrophically due to superior American intelligence and tactical execution. The loss of 4 aircraft carriers and their experienced air crews at Midway crippled Japan's ability to conduct offensive operations and marked the beginning of a long retreat that would end only with Japan's surrender. Allied forces also successfully fought back in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands and removed the threat to Australia. These campaigns demonstrated that Japanese forces, while still formidable, were no longer the unstoppable force they had appeared to be in the first months of the war. More importantly, they showed that the United States and its allies were learning to fight effectively in the challenging conditions of the Pacific theater. The turning of the tide in the Pacific coincided with increasingly difficult conditions on the Japanese home front. The Japanese home front was elaborately organized, block by block, with full-scale food rationing and many controls over labor. The government used propaganda heavily and planned in minute detail regarding the mobilization of manpower, identification of critical choke points, food supplies, logistics, air raid shelters, and the evacuation of children and civilians from targeted cities. The organization of Japanese society for total war was remarkably comprehensive and effective, at least initially. Japan's bloc and neighborhood associations became the comprehensive units for home front mobilization after 1940, charged with civil defense, food rationing, collection of national savings, and mutual surveillance. Membership was mandatory. This system created a web of social control that penetrated into every aspect of daily life, ensuring that the demands of the war effort took precedence over individual needs and desires. However, the effectiveness of this system began to break down as the war continued, and conditions became increasingly desperate. Food supplies were very tight before the heavy bombing began in fall 1944, then grew to a crisis. The Japanese domestic food supply depended upon imports, which were largely cut off by the American submarine and bombing campaigns. Likewise, there was little deep-sea fishing, so that the fish ration by 1941 was mostly squid harvested from coastal waters. The result was a growing food shortage, especially in the cities. The breakdown of Japan's maritime supply lines had devastating consequences for civilian life. Rationing reduced rice and other food purchases to 1/500 calories, subsistence levels. But as the war continued into 1945, even that amount was often not available. A government survey in Tokyo showed that in 1944, families depended on the black market for 9% of their rice, 38% of their fish, and 69% of their vegetables. The desperation of Japanese civilians during this period is difficult to overstate. Personal accounts reveal the joy that civilians had in finding a noodle or bean at the bottom of a soup bowl. The government put school children and other civilians to work collecting acorns in a desperate attempt to utilize every possible food resources. As conditions on the home front deteriorated, the strategic bombing campaign against Japan began in earnest. The arrival of B-29 Superfortress bombers in late 1944 gave the United States the capability to strike directly at the Japanese home islands with unprecedented force and frequency. The later U.S. bombing campaign against mainland Japan was slow to start. The arrival of B-29 Superfortress bombers in 1944 gave the Americans the range to reach Japanese cities, first from bases in China and then from Pacific Islands. The bombing campaign that followed would prove to be one of the most destructive in human history. Bombing of Tokyo, March 9–10, 1945. Firebombing raid, codenamed Operation Meeting House, by the United States on the capital of Japan during the final stages of World War II, often cited as one of the most destructive acts of war in history, more destructive than the bombing of Dresden, Hiroshima, or Nagasaki. The strikes conducted by the USAAF on the night of 9–10 March 1945, codenamed Operation Meeting House, constitute the single most destructive aerial bombing raid in human history. On the night of March 9, 1945, Allied forces launched Operation Meeting House. The operation had over 300 B-29 superfortresses take to the sky loaded with napalm incendiary bombs. The decision to use incendiary bombs rather than conventional explosives reflected American understanding of Japanese urban construction and the vulnerability of Japanese cities to fire. Firebombs were chosen over conventional high explosives because experimental raids and a previous fire in 1923 proved that Japanese cities were particularly vulnerable to fires due to the prevalence of wood and paper construction. Using firebombing tactics, the wood and paper structures that housed the population had been reduced to ashes, and in the resulting conflagrations, war industry factories were also destroyed. The strategic logic behind the bombing campaign was both military and psychological. According to U.S. military analysts, the high-altitude bombings that preceded Operation Meeting House did not deliberately target civilians. However, the Japanese military had long made it a practice to place factories in residential areas in the hope of disguising them. The result was that the bombers could not avoid inflicting civilian casualties. With the adoption of the new bombing strategy, no distinction was made between industrial, military, and civilian targets. The firebombing was comprehensive, meant to destroy whole sections of the city at once. The human cost of the bombing campaign was staggering. The firebombings continued until the end of the war, with an estimated 330,000 Japanese civilians killed and at least 8 million left homeless, and with an estimated 40% of Japan's urban areas destroyed. 60% of Tokyo itself went up in flames. The wider strategic and area bombing campaign against Japan killed more than 300,000 people and injured an additional 400,000, mostly civilians. The psychological impact of the bombing was as devastating as the physical destruction. The strategic bombing of Japan was a disaster that could not be hidden by control of the press. These raids must have come as a huge shock and may well have been the first indication to the Japanese people that the war had turned into a national disaster. For the first time since the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, foreign forces were striking directly at the Japanese homeland, shattering the myth of Japanese invincibility and the protective barrier of the surrounding seas. The bombing campaign also triggered one of the largest population movements in Japanese history. The government began making evacuation plans in late 1943 and started removing entire schools from industrial cities to the countryside, where they were safe from bombing and had better access to food supplies. In all, 1.3 million children were moved, with their teachers but not their parents. When the American bombing began in earnest in late 1944, 10 million people fled the cities to the safety of the countryside, including two-thirds of the residents of the largest cities and 87% of the children. About 8.5 million Japanese civilians were displaced from their homes between 1943 and 1945 as a result of air raids on Japan by the United States Army Air Forces, USAAF, during the Pacific War. This massive displacement created enormous social and economic disruption, separating families, disrupting education, and creating refugee populations that strained already limited resources in rural areas. The government's response to the bombing campaign revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of Japanese wartime organization. Wartime regulations gave the state powerful legal weapons against those residents who fled their neighborhoods without permission in the face of air raids. The revised Air Defense Law of 1941 obligated civilians to fulfill the duty to engage in stopgap firefighting during air attacks. Moreover, if the Home Minister or his prefectural governors deemed it necessary to air defense, they could prohibit or restrict anyone from leaving the neighborhood. Violators faced up to 1 year in prison with heavy labor or a maximum fine of 1,000 yen. But more often, Japanese authorities preferred extra-legal sanctions, advising the local block associations to deny food rations to residents who failed to perform civil defense duties or who ran away. This system created tragic situations where civilians were forced to choose between physical safety and social survival. In one tragic episode in the last days of the war, large numbers of terrified residents of Aomori fled the city after U.S. planes dropped leaflets warning that Aomori might be one of the next bombing targets. The prefectural governor thereupon issued an injunction that, if residents do not return to Aomori by 28 July, they will be removed from their block association registers and will no longer receive rationed goods, primarily food. An official notice in the local newspaper likened fleeing townspeople to military deserters who have left their homes virtually empty and their city undefended. Many hungry civilians returned to Aomori, just in time to experience the 100-bomber night raid of 28 July that killed 728 people. As 1945 progressed, it became increasingly clear that Japan's position was hopeless. The strategic bombing campaign had by mid-1945 destroyed Japan's transportation system. Had Japan not surrendered, August 1945, Japanese civilians would have starved in large numbers during the winter of 1945-46. The combination of the bombing campaign, the naval blockade, and the loss of overseas territories had reduced Japan to a state of near-complete isolation and resource depletion. The once proud Japanese Navy has been almost completely destroyed. But now American surface vessels and carriers patrolled the waters south of Japan. And to complete the blockade of Japan, aerial mines had been dropped in all important ports. This meant that raw material and petroleum could no longer supply the few factories that had survived the bombing. It also meant that badly needed food could not reach Japan. And the Japanese had already been forced to strictly ration food to virtual starvation levels. Despite these desperate conditions, Japanese resistance continued. The concept of Yamato Damashi, the Japanese spirit, had been so deeply ingrained in Japanese culture and military doctrine that surrender remained virtually unthinkable for most Japanese leaders. They preferred to fight to the death, rather than accept the dishonor of defeat, even if it meant the complete destruction of Japan itself. This fanatical resistance was most dramatically displayed in the development of kamikaze tactics. In the later stages of the Second World War in the Pacific, Japan was desperate. They turned to a new tactic: kamikaze. The kamikaze campaign trained attack squadrons specifically for this purpose, and brought into combat a new aircraft, the Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, the only jet-powered suicide aircraft. They first saw action at the Battle of Okinawa in 1945, where extensive damage was done to the Allied fleet. The kamikaze attacks represented both the ultimate expression of Japanese martial spirit and a recognition of Japan's desperate military situation. The Japanese had at first attempted to intercept the B-29s with fighters, but with limited and consumed irreplaceable fuel reserves, so by June they stopped interception attempts. This was to conserve available planes and fuel for a massive kamikaze assault on the expected American invasion fleet. In April 1945, the Americans assaulted Okinawa, only 350 miles from Japan. Hundreds of kamikaze suicide planes failed to stop the landings. The failure of the kamikaze attacks to prevent the American conquest of Okinawa demonstrated that even the most extreme sacrifices could not overcome American material superiority and tactical skill. It was against this backdrop of destruction, starvation, and military collapse that American scientists completed work on the most terrible weapon in human history. The Manhattan Project, begun in 1942, had successfully developed two types of atomic bombs: Little Boy, an enriched uranium gun-type fission weapon, and Fat Man, a plutonium implosion-type nuclear weapon. The decision to use these weapons against Japan has remained one of the most controversial aspects of World War II. The Allies called for the unconditional surrender of the Imperial Japanese Armed Forces in the Potsdam Declaration on 26 July 1945, the alternative being prompt and utter destruction. The Japanese government ignored the ultimatum. On August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. On 6 August 1945, at 8:15 a.m. local time, the United States detonated an atomic bomb over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. At 8:15 on the morning of 6 August 1945, the Japanese city of Hiroshima was devastated by the first atomic bomb to be used as a weapon of war. The bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, was dropped from the USAAF B-29 bomber Enola Gay and exploded some 1,800 feet above the city. Delivering the equivalent of around 12.5 kilotons of TNT, the bomb reduced 5 square miles of the city center to ashes and caused the deaths of an estimated 120,000 people within the first 4 days following the blast. Many were instantly vaporized by the explosion. Others died afterwards from the effects of burns and radiation. The Japanese government's initial response to Hiroshima was one of confusion and disbelief. Throughout the day, confused reports reached Tokyo that Hiroshima had been the target of an air raid, which had leveled the city with a blinding flash and violent blast. Later that day, they received U.S. President Truman's broadcast announcing the first use of an atomic bomb, confirming their worst fears about the nature of the weapon that had destroyed the city. The day after the bombing, the Japanese Imperial Cabinet convened and argued at length over ending the war promptly by accepting the Potsdam Proclamation. However, military leaders remained resistant to surrender. Many Japanese, and in particular the military members of the government, refused to believe the United States had built an atomic bomb, and the Japanese military ordered their own independent tests to determine the cause of Hiroshima's destruction. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, the chief of the Naval General Staff, argued that even if the United States had made one, they could not have many more. This resistance to surrender led to the second atomic bombing. 3 days after Hiroshima, on August 9, 1945, just after 11 on the morning of 9th August, a second atomic bomb nicknamed Fat Man exploded above the city of Nagasaki. Although it was even more powerful than Little Boy, the destruction caused by this bomb was less than at Hiroshima due to the nature of the terrain. Fat Man, which detonated at 11:02 local time at an altitude of 1,650 feet, killed about half as many people in Nagasaki as the uranium-based Little Boy had in Hiroshima 3 days earlier, despite a force estimated at 21 kilotons, or 40% greater. Still, the effect was devastating. Close to 40,000 people were killed instantly, and a third of the city was destroyed. The timing of the Nagasaki bombing was particularly significant because it coincided with another catastrophic development for Japan. Late on 8 August 1945, in accordance with the Yalta Agreements, but in violation of the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, and soon after midnight on 9 August 1945, the Soviet Union invaded the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo. Hours later, the U.S. dropped a second atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Nagasaki. The Soviet entry into the war may have been even more decisive than the atomic bombs in forcing Japan's surrender. The most prominent proponent of this theory is Tsuyoshi Hasegawa, who has argued that the invasion was far more important than the bombs in contributing to the surrender. Hasegawa's arguments are partly based on chronology. The Japanese government made important decisions about surrender after the invasion, rather than after the Hiroshima bombing 3 days earlier. And then, after midnight of August 8–9, Soviet Far East time, Soviet tanks rolled into Manchuria and planes attacked Japanese forces. It was only then, on the morning of August 9th, that the Supreme War Council was convened for the first time. It had not met following the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, but it was convened immediately after the Soviet attack. During the heated debate at the Supreme War Council, the first news of the second atomic bomb on Nagasaki was conveyed to the Japanese leaders. The combination of the atomic bombings and Soviet entry into the war finally broke Japanese resistance. Emperor Hirohito subsequently ordered the Supreme Council for the direction of the war to accept the terms the Allies had set down in the Potsdam Declaration. After several more days of behind-the-scenes negotiations and a failed coup d'état by hardliners in the Japanese military, Emperor Hirohito gave a recorded radio address announcing Japan's surrender. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's unconditional surrender, bringing World War II to a close. At noon on August 15, 1945, Japanese time, Emperor Hirohito announced his country's surrender in a radio broadcast. The news spread quickly, and Victory in Japan or VJ Day celebrations broke out across the United States and other allied nations. The formal surrender agreement was signed on September 2nd aboard the U.S. battleship Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay. The human cost of Japan's war had been catastrophic. The aerial bombings killed 150,000 to 246,000 people, most of whom were civilians, and remain the only uses of nuclear weapons in an armed conflict. Because of the extent of the devastation and chaos, including the fact that much of the two cities' infrastructure was wiped out, exact death tolls from the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki remain unknown. However, it's estimated roughly 70,000 to 135,000 people died in Hiroshima, and 60,000 to 80,000 people died in Nagasaki, both from acute exposure to the blasts and from long-term side effects of radiation. When the total cost of Japan's participation in World War II is calculated, the numbers are staggering. Millions of Japanese military personnel died in combat across the Pacific, Southeast Asia, and China. Hundreds of thousands of civilians died in the bombing campaigns. Millions more were left homeless, injured, or traumatized by their experiences. The economic devastation was equally comprehensive. Japan's cities lay in ruins. Its industrial capacity was destroyed. Its merchant marine was at the bottom of the ocean, and its overseas empire was completely lost. After the war, Tokyo struggled to rebuild. In 1945 and 1946, the city received a share of the national reconstruction budget, roughly proportional to its amount of bombing damage, 26.6%. But in successive years, Tokyo saw this share dwindle. By 1949, Tokyo was given only 10.9% of the budget, at the same time that runaway inflation had significantly devalued the Japanese currency. Occupation authorities such as Joseph Dodge eventually stepped in and drastically cut back on Japanese government rebuilding programs, focusing instead on simply improving roads and transportation. Tokyo did not experience fast economic growth until the 1950s. The occupation of Japan that followed surrender represented a complete transformation of Japanese society, politics, and culture. The United States gained wide-reaching influence in Japan during its occupation and as a result of its installation of the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, a title held by the American General Douglas MacArthur. The U.S. occupation of Japan had long and lasting effects on daily life in Japan, as well as on Japan's economy, military, and government. The story of Japan's participation in World War II serves as one of history's most powerful cautionary tales about the dangers of military adventurism, ideological extremism, and the refusal to acknowledge reality when it conflicts with deeply held beliefs. Japan entered the war believing that superior will and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage, and that swift early victories could create a strategic situation that would force enemies to accept negotiated peace rather than pay the cost of total war. These calculations proved catastrophically wrong. American industrial capacity, once fully mobilized, produced weapons, ships, and aircraft at a rate that Japan could never hope to match. American strategic bombing, combined with naval blockade, reduced Japan to a state of near starvation by 1945. Most critically, American willingness to pay the costs of total war, both in resources and human lives, far exceeded Japanese expectations and ultimately made Japanese resistance futile. The atomic bombings that ended the war introduced a new and terrible dimension to human conflict. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki produced effects in Japan and around the world that changed the course of history. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki also caused global effects such as the Cold War and the proliferation of nuclear weapons around the world. The Cold War was a rivalry that saw the world's two remaining superpowers after World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union, as well as their respective allies, fight for political, economic, and nuclear superiority. The legacy of Japan's World War II experience shaped not only Japan's subsequent development, but also the entire structure of international relations in the post-war world. Japan's transformation from a militaristic empire to a pacifist democracy represented one of the most complete reversals in modern history. The Japanese people, having experienced the ultimate consequences of unchecked military power and aggressive nationalism, embraced a new constitution that renounced war as an instrument of national policy. The economic miracle that transformed Japan into one of the world's most prosperous nations within a generation of its defeat demonstrated the positive potential of the same industriousness, organizational skill, and national discipline that had once served military conquest. By channeling these qualities into peaceful economic competition rather than military aggression, Japan achieved a prosperity and security that had eluded it during its imperial period. For the United States, victory in the Pacific established American hegemony over the world's largest ocean and created a network of alliances and bases that would define American strategic policy for the remainder of the 20th century. The atomic bombs that ended the war also ushered in the nuclear age, creating weapons of such destructive power that they fundamentally changed the nature of international conflict. The Pacific War also marked the end of the European colonial empires in Asia. Japanese conquest had shattered the myth of European invincibility and inspired independence movements across the region. Although Japan's own empire was destroyed, the war it began ultimately led to the decolonization of much of Asia and the emergence of new nations from Indonesia to India. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Japan in World War II serves as a reminder of the human capacity for both great evil and remarkable redemption. The same nation that committed terrible atrocities across Asia also demonstrated remarkable resilience in rebuilding itself according to peaceful and democratic principles. The Japanese people who endured the atomic bombings and foreign occupation also created one of the world's most stable and prosperous societies. As we reflect on this chapter of history, we are reminded that the choices made by nations and their leaders have consequences that extend far beyond their immediate time and place. The decision to attack Pearl Harbor set in motion a chain of events that transformed the entire Pacific region and ultimately the world. The courage and sacrifice of those who fought in the Pacific War, on all sides, should inspire us to work for a world in which such conflicts become impossible. The atomic bombs that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki remain the only nuclear weapons ever used in warfare. They serve as a permanent reminder of the ultimate consequences of international conflict in the nuclear age. The survivors of these bombings, known as hibakusha, have spent their lives working to ensure that such weapons are never used again. Their testimony provides perhaps the most powerful argument for the peaceful resolution of international disputes. Japan's story in World War II ultimately demonstrates both the terrible costs of aggressive war and the possibility of redemption through peaceful development. From the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a new Japan emerged, one committed to peace, democracy, and international cooperation. This transformation offers hope that even the most militaristic societies can change, and that the lessons of history, however painful, can guide us toward a more peaceful future. The rising sun that had symbolized Japanese imperial ambitions finally set on August 15, 1945, when Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. But from that sunset emerged a new dawn, not just for Japan, but for the entire world. The Pacific War that began with the attack on Pearl Harbor ended not only a global conflict, but an entire era of history. In its place came the nuclear age, the Cold War, decolonization, and the emergence of a new international order. The story of Japan in World War II reminds us that history is made by human choices, and that those choices have consequences that can last for generations. It challenges us to learn from the past, to recognize the warning signs of international conflict before it becomes too late to prevent, and to work for a world in which the horrors of total war become nothing more than historical memory. In remembering Japan's journey through World War II, from imperial triumph to nuclear devastation to peaceful reconstruction, we honor not only those who suffered and died in that conflict, but also those who must never be asked to endure such suffering again.